So we were saying, so there was 10 kids.
10,
No, I'm sorry.
11
11
kids. 11
One
kids.
had died on the trip over.
Right.
The oldest born girl.
Right.
And one had died just a week after childbirth.
Right.
Okay, and that left 9.
That's right.
The first one born probably somewhere between 1898 and 1900. Would you say guess?
I'm guessing.
Because
late
by
1800s, right?
Because by 1906 or maybe even 1905, he had 4 kids already.
Right.
And then based on when people got married that day, she was probably a teenager.
I'm sure she was a teenager.
Okay.
Right.
So let's say between 1898 and 1900. Let's say she was 17.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
So that, and then the last one was born in 1922. You said
1922.
Harry was born in 1922.
Yes.
So let's say she was in 1899. She was 17. 23. That's age 40. She was still having babies.
Children, right.
So was that normal at the
That
time
was normal,
to have those big kind of families?
In that community, in the Orthodox
community?
Jewish community, yes.
Okay, so that would be normal.
They weren't allowed to use birth control.
Was there even birth control back then?
No birth control.
Okay,
No.
sorry, no clinical birth control.
Right.
So, all right. So, and then so let me ask you about
I'm glad
citizenship.
you were named after Hannah.
Right. My middle name.
His middle name was Henri.
Henri or Henry. All right. So so let me ask you about citizenship. How did they become citizens? Did they ever become citizens?
Yes. Well, from my father on, it was
They were
born in the
automatic.
United States.
Right. So all those children were
I'm
citizens.
assuming that the 3 children who were brought here and
Mm-hmm.
my grandmother and grandfather became naturalized citizens.
Okay.
I can't guarantee that that's true.
Right. They
But
never
I
really.
assume at least that the children, that Irving, Herman, and Sophie, I'm sure became citizens because they used to vote and all these other things.
Right.
Now, whether my grandfather and my grandmother, I can't swear became citizens because their English was really rather limited. They spoke Yiddish.
Right.
It was their first language.
And Yiddish was
almost a dialect of German that was spoken by virtually all Jews in Europe.
Okay.
That's still spoken today
Mm-hmm.
in the Orthodox Jewish communities in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
That are the Hasidic Jews. Still, their first language is Yiddish, not English.
Now talking about your grandparents still. So did Henoch work as a butcher his entire life that you remember?
He worked as a butcher for a good part of his life, and then as an older man, I guess the butcher, after his children were grown and was starting to become semi-successful, and they weren't all as needy, and they started having some money. I guess he gave up the butcher shop, and he became, in West New York there was used to be a guy who owned a chicken market, sold live, fresh chickens.
Live.
The chickens were alive. When you bought them, they were no longer alive.
He would take care of that for you.
And that's what his name was Marzigliano. He owned 2.
Was he Italian?
He was Italian. He owned 2 chicken. If you wanted chicken, if you wanted meat, you used to go to the butcher.
Right.
If you wanted chicken, you went to the chicken store.
To the poultry shop.
And he owned 2 of them. One on 67th Street on Bergen Line Avenue, and one on 48th Street on Bergen Line Avenue. And my grandfather, from when I can remember, from being a young child, until I guess he retired, what was known as retirement, whatever that was in that years, became what is known as a sheket. A sheket is a person, an Orthodox Jewish person, who, when they if you went into the store and Joey Marzigliano cut the chicken's neck, that chicken was not kosher.
Very unkosher. Very dirty
When my
chicken.
grandfather Henoch, who became a sheket, when he killed the chicken in his hands, it became a kosher chicken. So Marzigliano had in the 1940s and 50s, and I guess up until the maybe in the very early 60s, had a large Jewish community service.
Right.
And if they wanted a kosher chicken, Henoch, Richman, would kill the chicken, and he would say the prayer as he killed the chicken.
Did you ever see this happen?
I actually did see it.
You did?
I absolutely.
So you were a child, or
I was a child. I must have been 4, 5, 6, 7.
So what are your memories of that?
My memories are this store that had these cages stacked one on top of the other, top of the other.
Was it loud?
Wooden.
With chickens in them.
Loud? Do you remember?
Loud, cackling chickens in there, and they had sawdust on the floor, and people used to come down the cage and pick out the chicken they wanted, and they would take the chicken. I remember this. By the neck and bring it over to the block.
They meaning your grandfather, or do you remember?
My grandfather. And he would take the knife and go bang, and the chicken would still be fluttering.
The chicken still moved.
Yeah. And then he would pull the
feathers.
The feathers out, and he would put salt on it, kosher salt, and that made it kosher.
Can you picture this in your mind?
I can actually picture that in my mind. Absolutely.
Did it freak you out at all, or it's hard to remember what you were thinking? Maybe.
I don't know what I was thinking, but I can still remember. So it was obviously a traumatic experience.
Interesting. Well,
yeah.
But you just remember seeing that once. That was the only time.
I remember seeing it. I don't know how many times I did it, but it is ingrained in my mind. Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting. What about the butcher shop? Was that before your time?
Before mine. Before.
Okay. Right.
I think he gave that up. I think he became.
So did he just work for this guy? Or
he worked for Marzigliano.
He didn't have. He wasn't part owner of the business or anything.
He didn't own it. No, he did own the butcher shop, but he didn't. My
so
father used to deliver the meat. He used to tell me all the time that was one of his jobs. He would deliver the meat to all the people.
From the butcher shop.
From the butcher shop, right.
So it was sort of a family business, like all the kids would help.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So this was sort of as he got older. This was him slowing down a little bit. Like maybe it wasn't as much work.
After the butcher shop, I think it was just became a job. After that, it wasn't slowed down. I think he worked all the time.
And you said your grandmother worked also.
I think she worked in the butcher shop because again, only reason I know that is we have a picture of her and him in their bloody aprons.
That's great.
Standing.
Do you have that picture?
I think I do.
Okay.
Standing in front of the butcher shop.
Interesting. Interesting. So, so as a child. So by the way, how do you get? Did you get like certified to be that? I forget the name.
Check it. Yeah.
You have to be certified by a rabbi.
Well, yes, I think you had.
Now your grandfather was never was he ever a rabbi? Considered a rabbi?
He never became a rabbi. He became what is known as a gabbai, Gabbi, which was sort of a rabbi's assistant.
Okay.
And he held that position in the Sharazadic synagogue from the day it opened until the day he died. He was the gab. There were two gabbis in the.
Was there rabbis also, or did they?
There was always a rabbi. Yes, they always. And the rabbis changed. At least.
No, the rabbi was a full-time position.
Full-time position, yes.
So he had to work. He maybe could have become a rabbi. He was studying, but he had to work and support his family.
He got interrupted by this whole. Thing of going into the army and then escaping Eastern Europe and coming to the United States.
And then he had to work to support his family,
because they had no
get his
money.
family around.
He had a family.
So actually pretty amazing if you think about it. Within a year working in a sweatshop, bringing your family over, another year of working, and then at a factory, maybe a year or 2 years, and then starting your own business.
Well, I don't know how long he worked. He worked in the factory in the Lower East Side, then he worked in the factory in West New York.
Right.
And then I don't know how many years he did that, but then he started his own. But I guess it was as the Jewish community was becoming larger and larger and larger and needed services to sustain themselves, that he became a kosher.
So one guy became the butcher, one guy became the tailor, one guy became the
what I mean? Exactly. Right.
But it was a close knit community, so they would use each other for their service.
I'm sure because they hardly spoke English.
Right.
So it was just like any immigrant society starts out. They congregate together, and then you know, and then eventually when they have children who assimilate into the culture of this country, and then they start disseminating out. But this group stays together.
What are your memories of your grandfather and your grandmother as a child? Well, first of all, how old were you when your grandmother and grandfather passed away?
My grandmother passed away in 1949.
So you were
I
about
was
8?
8 years old.
Okay.
And she was ill for many years before that. She had cancer. And so my vivid memories of my grandmother on my father's side are one of her being kind of sick. But she was always a very quiet, sweet lady. My father and my family lived on the same block that they lived in. Now you have to remember that my father's family, Irving, Herman, Sophie, Nathan, Sam, all lived the traditional life. They grew up, they got married, and had their own families. The 4 youngest children, Abe, Rose, Evelyn, and Harry, all stayed home, never got married. So the quote Richmonds, we used to be known as the Richmans, which lived at 6040 Highland Place, was my grandmother and grandfather and my 4 uncles and aunts. They all still lived on 6040 Highland Place. We happened to live on the same block as 6106 Highland Place, about 6 houses away from them. So I was really, and my father, as you know, and his brothers and sisters had a extraordinarily close relationship. They talked to each other every single day. It was a super close relationship. Even to strange, even to this, unheard of, absolutely unheard of. And I used to go with my father virtually every day after dinner to visit the quote Richmonds at 6040.
So this is every night?
Virtually every night.
Virtually every night.
And so what were you telling? My recollections. My recollections are.
Well, you can continue with that story.
But that's you know, it was a very strange, unusual relationship they had from when they were children all the way to their adult life. They talked to each other virtually every day. And
so your father, so the other ones all kind of left, and then the 4 stayed. So the four left. Right?
4 left.
The 4 stayed.
Right. They didn't leave. They all lived.
They all lived in the same town.
They all lived in the same area.
They left, got married, had their own.
Some of them went as far away as North Bergen.
The next town
which
over?
is about 20 blocks away.
Okay, 20 blocks. Right. And then your father was sort of in between. He leaves home, has his own family, but
stays next door, virtually
next door, and stays the closest to the brothers and sisters that stay at home.
Absolutely. They were all close, I shouldn't say that, but he was like sort of, he's the one that they relied on the most.
Because he was sort of part of the outside world.
He was the outside world. He was the connection to the shut-in world.
Right.
It wasn't really a shut-in world now. They were sort of like, the 4 youngest was sort of like Dr. Jekyll's and Mr. Hyde's, because they all went out to work.
Right.
And when they went out to work, they were like normal, regular people.
Right.
Except that when they came home from work, that's where the world ended. They never ventured.
Never did anything else.
They never did anything.
Just came home, and that was their life.
That was it.
Took the dog out.
Interesting. Okay. So your recollections of Henoch?
Henoch was a very. My recollections of him are he was always sitting up in his house and reading some sort of religious prayer book. Always doing that. Very nice, quiet man, but always either saying his prayers or reading the Bible. I guess it was either the Bible or the Talmud or whatever it was that he read, but he was always reading that.
So it goes without saying that he was considered an Orthodox Jew.
Orthodox Jew. He was not what you would consider a Sedum. He didn't have payas, and he didn't wear the black garb.
Did he have a beard?
He did have a beard, yes.
Right. Okay.
He did have a beard.
And so, like the times that your grandmother too.
And my grandmother was my recollections are that she was always kind of ill, and she would always be sitting up in a chair or lying in bed. And when I would come up she would have a little change purse, one of those change purses that clipped open, and she would come over, Danielle, they call me, Danielle, come over here, and she would give me a penny or a nickel or something, and she would pat my head, like that. Those were my recollections of her.
Now, what about when Hedok was like praying? Was that like some place that you couldn't go interrupt him?
No.
That was okay. That was just his normal.
Okay, it was just as normal every day.
It wasn't like this scary guy or anything like that.
No, absolutely. We used to go, and sometimes I would go there by myself. I would go up to the apartment, and I remember, the front of his house and the front of our house were, on the same block. And I remember when I went to go down there, I would say, I'm going to go home now, and he would stick his head out the window. They lived on the second floor, and he would watch me walk up the street. And he'd say, "Okay, Daniel, go ahead." And he would wait till I got into the house before I would make sure that I got home already.
That's cool.
Right.
And then, do you remember anything about their deaths?
I can remember distinctly it was on Yom Kippur in 1948. And I used to have to go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur with my father. And I was in the synagogue with my father. And
so you were 7 years old?
I was 7 years old. And all of a sudden the rabbi made an announcement that they were going to blow the shofar early so that Hedok Richman could leave because there was a problem in his house.
Wow.
And they all left. My grandfather and my father and all my uncles left.
You
and
there?
I was there, right? I was there
wow.
in the synagogue.
How many blocks away was the synagogue from your house?
We lived on 60th Street and Boulevard East. The synagogue was on 54th and Palisade Avenue, which was like 6 blocks
You had moved
the other way. It
from
was about 12, 13, a mile away. I would say maybe three-quarters of a mile away.
So you were there with a bunch of guys, all the
with my friends. I was.
Oh, okay, I see. Because everyone brought their kids.
Everyone
who was Jewish was there
in the community, in the Jewish community.
I got you. And you didn't know what was going on.
I didn't know what was going on. No.
Interesting. So you remember anything after that? Do you remember being told or the funeral?
I remember my father coming home later that night and said his mother died. He came in and told me that grandma died.
And he cried.
Do you remember him being? Yeah.
He was crying. Right. They were very, very close to their mother. Very close. They admired her dramatically. Very, very much so.
When you say they admired her, what do you think they admired about her?
I don't know. I really can't.
Because you didn't know her that well.
I didn't know her that well, but they all were extremely close, especially to their mother.
Right.
She was, they used to say that she was a saint.
Right.
That's the way they would describe her, that she was so good to them.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah, they really was. And my grandfather was sort of this guy who was always...
he was working, or he was doing religious services,
or praying, or in the synagogue. Because he used to go to the synagogue every day, twice a day. And on Saturday, he would stay there from like 7:30 in the morning till like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And on Yom Kippur, he would stay there the entire day.
Right.
And he had a seat on the eastern wall.
He had a seat on the eastern wall.
Which was that what is that?
The eastern wall is supposed to be the most prestigious place to sit in the synagogue because it faces Jerusalem, faces to the east, to Jerusalem.
So your sense was that she sort of raised those kids, a lot on her own, and which was normal back then, but especially maybe even more because not only did he have a job, he had the religious things he was doing.
Right. I think it was the woman's job to raise the family. That's what it was. And I think my Aunt Sophie, who was the oldest daughter, was her lieutenant. She helped because there were so many kids.
Right.
So she was like the secondary mother.
Right.
For the family,
Interesting.
And then Herman and Irving, when they were teenagers, went out and started working. They became plumbers. So they were the first ones to escape the old world, lifestyle.
Did they graduate from high school? No.
Irving or Herman never, or Sophie, I don't think ever.
So your father went to graduate high school and then graduated college, right?
Went to college. He got his master's degree too.
And
he was the first one to go to college in that family.
Did you ever talk to him about why he chose that as opposed to the other kids? Never.
No.
Just okay.
No, it was just assumed, I guess.
But you never heard a bad word said about your grandmother.
Never.
They just adored her.
No, they did.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, what about when your grandfather?
My grandfather, when he got older.
Now, how old was
my grandfather died. My grandmother died in 1948. My grandfather lived considerably longer. He died like in the early 1960s.
So your grandmother may have been maybe 60, 65 years old,
Probably.
somewhere like that. Okay.
Probably. Mm-hmm. But he lived to 86.
Wow.
And
same house, stayed in the same house.
Same house, stayed in Highland Place. They all stayed there.
Do you remember any change in him after she died, or?
Not early, but then he got ill.
Okay.
He got ill with the famous Richman disease, which in those days they called hardening of the arteries,
right?
Which today we call Alzheimer's disease. But he definitely had Alzheimer's disease, and I guess from like year 82, 83, he was starting to act a little erratically, and he would be like at 3 o'clock in the morning he would get dressed, and they say, "Where are you going?" He's going to shul. And or he'd be wandering around, and they would find him, and he'd fall and all these things. And so that's how he died, as did Irving, and as did Herman, and Sophie did not have Alzheimer's. She had
Dementia, but no.
but she had Parkinson's, which dementia is part of the. But they all lived to very long ages. They all lived. Herman and Irving lived like to the late 80s. My grandfather lived to 86. My father lived to 88. So they all had long.
Sophie was 95.
Yeah, Sophie was in her 94, 95.
What about Sam?
Sam died earlier.
Late 70s.
He died in his late 70s, but he had diabetes. He was the only one, by the way, Sam, that didn't have Alzheimer's.
Didn't get any dementia.
No dementia.
Right.
Well, he didn't live long enough.
Well, no, but he was
in their 80s.
But no. They by their late 70s, I think
He was not.
They were showing signs of it.
Right.
Then, right.
Well, could be.
I think they were starting to show signs.
I think Sam was in his early 80s when he died.
Yeah.
82, 83.
And then
Evelyn actually died the youngest. My Aunt Evelyn, and she died in her 50s, I guess, of scleroderma.
Is that a skin cancer, or is that a skin disease?
It's a cancer of the skin, right.
Do you have a recollection of that?
I have a very, very horrible recollection of her dying.
Yeah.
Because her skin became extremely taut. Her hands became like claw-like, and the skin turned like a different, like a brownish, orangey color.
And she was at home.
She was at home, and she died at home, right.
And she was. You have to say how old?
I would say in her 50s.
In her 50s?
Early 50s, probably.
And then with Sam, and then Abe.
Abe died of dementia.
Alzheimer's.
Probably Alzheimer's, right.
And he was in his 80s?
He was in his 84 or something like that.
And then Rose
and Abe died in the same year. Rose had been ill for many years. And they kept her they never, kept her in the house, and she eventually had dementia, most likely Alzheimer's, and she had cataracts that were never treated and became blind. Right. And she died. She died in the house. They all died in the house. Right. And she died like in May, and then Abe died in June.
Right. But they had sort of lived, when you see them and meet them, they almost seemed like a husband and wife.
Yes.
Right. They sort of lived.
That was that was the family. I mean,
right.
Harry was a pharmacist, and he worked like 7 days a week constantly. Right. Evelyn died at an early age, and Abe and Rose was sort of like a family group.
They stayed in the house, and,
exactly,
and almost lived like a couple.
Exactly.
Right.
And they died in order.
They died in the order that they were born.
Except for Evelyn.
Except for Evelyn.
Right. So, but all of them died exactly in birth order?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow. Oops.
Yeah.
Oh.
No.
And Harry was the last one. Harry died about 2008. Was it?
He died, 2009, I think, 2009, I think. 4 years ago. 5 years ago.
5.
Interesting.
Now, how about my mother? You want to hear about my mother's family?
Next time.
What?
Next time.
I mean, that's it?
That's it.
Do I get like a fee for this thing?
You did very well.
If I think here.